48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Next, from the Virginia Festival of the Book, a panel discussion with 5 authors who've written about unexplained phenomena, conspiracy theories, and supernatural experiences. After that, a conversation with Christopher Andrew, who wrote The Sword and the Shield, about the history of the KGB. On Book TV tomorrow night, Lucas Poe discusses the politics of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren. Also, Malcolm Gladwell talks about The Tipping Point, his new book, exploring why certain ideas take hold in society and others do not. And Biography on Book TV looks at the generalship of Robert E. Lee with a panel of Lee biographers.
Can you tell us about a book that you've been reading?
Actually, we've all been reading Anne Frank. The Diary of Anne Frank. The Diary of a Young Girl.
And why are you reading it?
Well, it's for a class project, and it's like about her life in the Holocaust, and like, but we've all been finding it really interesting just how to see her in her isolation and how they all survived, like being together with 8 people in one secret attic.
Do you think that her story has anything to say to you guys about the way you live now?
Oh yeah, of course, because it shows people and it kind of teaches people that, like she said in the very ending of the diary actually, that everyone has a good side, and that she even respected everyone, and she respected everyone that even brought her like a little harshness because she learned in that time that she was reading her diary and everything.
Yeah, and she has like a lot of she has faith that like she can get out and just keep going to school like she was, and I don't know.
And at the end, are you all going to get together with all of your class and talk about it as a whole group?
Yeah, we've already started doing that, but we had a project to isolate ourselves for an hour each day for 7 days, and we couldn't listen to the radio.
We couldn't do anything with technology or radio, or we had to write.
Yeah, I think that really helped me understand what she was going through, and it really brought out what she went through.
Yes, for the last 6 months I've been trying to read this book, The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. I picked up one of those syllabuses from St. John's College where they read all the great books, and I was a terrible student in college. I didn't read anything I was supposed to read, so I'm trying to make up for lost time, and I got stuck with this book. This book is very dry.
Can you tell us about a book that you've read recently?
Yes, I had the good fortune of reading Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, a British author. It's published by Random House. Came out, I believe, in 1995, thereabouts. It's a fascinating story. It's about World War I and the incredible human sacrifice involved. The hero is a Britisher, and he has a love affair around 1910, before the war, with a French lady. But it's a little bit on the lurid side with regard to that affair. Overdo it, really. But aside from that, I thought it was a marvelous depiction of the horrors of trench warfare.
Our website, booktv.org, brings you a look at some of this week's best-selling books. Click on bestseller lists, and you'll find a sampling of nonfiction bestsellers from across the country. Here's a look at one of this week's featured lists. The top 10 best-selling nonfiction books according to the New York Times. Number 1 this week, Mitch Albom's Tuesdays with Morrie. It's followed by The Rock Says, an autobiography by the professional wrestler known as The Rock. In The Millionaire Mind, at number 3, Thomas Stanley poses questions designed to assess the reader's money-making potential. Then, former Reagan speechwriter Peggy Noonan's new book, The Case Against Hillary Clinton, comes in at number 4. Detective Steve Thomas discusses his involvement with the investigation into the murder of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey in JonBenet, written with Don Davis. Sidney Poitier writes about his life and career in The Measure of a Man, at number 6 this week. That's followed by Fair Ball, a fan's case for baseball by sportscaster Bob Costas. 'Tis, the follow-up memoir by Angela's Ashes author Frank McCourt, comes in at number 8 this week. Sybil Shepherd's new autobiography, Civil Disobedience, is 9th. And Dave Egger's memoir, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, rounds out the list at number 10. For book reviews and more bestseller lists, visit the New York Times website and click on Books. You're watching Book TV. 48 hours of programs about nonfiction books, authors, and the publishing industry. Every weekend here on C-SPAN 2. From the Virginia Festival of the Book in Charlottesville, Virginia, a discussion with several authors have written about unexplained phenomena, including conspiracy theories and supernatural experiences. The conversation lasts about an hour and a half.
Well, looks like this is it. Can you all hear me? Everybody hear me? And, let me just begin by getting a feel for where everyone is in the audience. Is there anybody here who can claim to have seen a UFO? Hands? A couple? Is there anyone here who can claim to have seen ghosts or anything like that? Out-of-body experiences? A couple? Is there anybody here who belongs to a cult? Yeah, Episcopal Church counts, actually. Is there anybody here who is packing right now? Well, I guess we can proceed then. Yeah. Today's subject ostensibly is American lunacies, and without being too flip about what's going on in the culture, what I'd like to do with the panel is examine, take the temperature basically of the zeitgeist, find out what's going on at the end of the millennium. Today's panelists include Joel Achenbach, who's a Washington Post columnist for the Washington Post daily online paper. His books include Why Things Are and Captured by Aliens. Next we have Michael Shermer, who's the editor of Skeptic magazine. He's the author of Why People Believe Weird Things and How We Believe. And on my right we have Jodi Deans, who's an associate professor at Hobart and Williams College. Have I got that right? I'm sorry, Hobart and William Smith College, and her book is Aliens in America. On the far right is Alex Hurd, the executive editor of Wired magazine, whose book is Apocalypse Pretty Soon.
Not too late.
It's never too late for an apocalypse, I guess. What I'd like to do is just ask everybody generally, in the broadest possible brushstrokes, to paint in where they think we are now compared to, let's say, the 1960s. Is this a kind of quiet upheaval going on with all the cults, or is this something totally new? Alex, what's your take on that?
Okay, well, I don't have any data on this. It's all just based on my reporting and reading I did. I think that there obviously was a lot of millennial and apocalyptic activity around the turn of the millennium, but one of the things is there always has been. I think the media noticed it more, and they will also tend to think that it's all going away because most of the media attention was on Y2K, and that fizzled, and most of those people have gone away, but a lot of them, you'll find over the years, if you keep up with this, will shift their energies about that to something else. And one of the new things, there's a bestseller by Art Bell called The Coming Age of Global Superstorms. And that's going to capture a lot of those people because he's saying that global warming and environmental change is going to bring a new kind of chaos and just storms that kill millions of people. So I think we're in a pretty active period and always will be, you know.
I understand Virginia, particularly, this is something we can all be proud of here. Virginia has quite a few cults going. Is that?
Yeah, although first thing I'd do is I don't really talk about cults much, except in the rare cases where that term applies. Most of these groups are political or religious groups. They just happen to be on the fringe. And cult is a pretty loaded term that doesn't really go for most of these people. But yeah, Virginia has everything. UFO people. There's a famous place called the Monroe Institute, a few miles from here, where they teach you to have out-of-body experiences, which at first glance doesn't seem millennial, but if you read the doctrines behind it, it is a very revelatory thing that has a long view attached to it.
Joel, what's your take on where the zeitgeist is right now?
Well, there's been a big change since the 1960s, really. I'm glad you brought that up, because it used to be that UFOs were very much of a hardware issue. People saw stuff in the skies they didn't understand. They saw, you know, lights or at least objects moving around in a strange way. And since then, it's become a much more personal thing, more of a software type issue in which people have these direct experiences. You know, for that reason, I try not to convert people to my own personal belief about aliens, which basically is that if I were to wake up one morning and find, you know, 3 little bald-headed, skinny creatures with 3 fingers each chewing on my foot, I still wouldn't believe in aliens. But I try not to try to convert people, because I know how personal the belief is to them. And for example, in my book kind of goes all over the place. I spend time talking to Carl Sagan and time talking to the people at NASA. But I also spend some time in UFO country, and a couple of the characters are people who believe that they themselves are aliens, that they think they're from the Pleiades, or that their spirit is from space. And this makes perfect sense to them, and it kind of explains why in their life they felt a little out of sorts, like they didn't really belong here on Earth, a little alienated, so to speak. And so I, you know, in talking to them, I at one point was hypnotized in a hotel room trying to recover the memory of my own alien abduction, but I totally failed at it. I couldn't quite picture what happened. But that doesn't actually prove that I wasn't abducted, because you see, that's how they work. You know, they're able to erase the memory of the abduction. So it doesn't prove anything.
Michael, how do you see all this? Does it relate to religion in some way?
Joel, they don't have 3 fingers, they have 4. So just make a correction there. Actually, on Wednesday, I was on a TV show, just a Southern California TV show, which is where I'm from. And by the way, parenthetically, Virginia is not the hotbed of weirdness. Southern California is. You guys have nothing on us. We own that category. Anyway, the show was ostensibly on psychics and haunted houses, that sort of thing. But while I was waiting in the green room, there was a couple of women astrologers there talking about crop circles. And I said, well, you know, what do you think they are? And she said, well, you know, the aliens have, you know, left these circles in these crops. And so I launched in this little routine I do that's actually usually pretty funny when I do it at Caltech for the skeptics. And it's like, you know, the chances of an extraterrestrial intelligence somehow mastering all the problems to conquer interstellar space travel and all the enormous technological advances they'd have to achieve to get here, and let alone even finding this obscure planet, what it would cost for them, and what are the chances they're going to do all that and just leave graffiti in Farmer Bob's field in Pucker Brush, Kansas. I mean, what is the likelihood of this? Then I do this whole thing about how, you know, we could just imagine, you know, at the planet Vega and at the Senate hearings about about what actually happened here, about the crop circles and stuff. And, you know, so let me get this straight, Senator Zorg. You know, you spent 50 quazillion zlotys in order to find this planet, and the best you could do is leave graffiti. You know, and the upheaval and the people that would be fired about this. And without missing a beat, and not even blinking, this woman says, they don't use money on Vega. And honestly, she said, I wouldn't make this up. Some stuff I just make up, but this I didn't. And I said, I didn't know what to say. I said, you know, I just made that up. And she said, no. And the Pleiadians, they don't have government, and, you know, they're way beyond money and government and possessions. And, you know, imagine no possessions. I did this whole thing. I wonder if you can. And she didn't get it, you know. She didn't just, you know. Anyway, so... And that's just a little sampling of what we do at Skeptic. We do try to take a pulse on this and try to keep track of this sort of thing. It is different from religion, certainly. Mainstream religions are not cults. You know, we need to use our language carefully, I think. Cult has become such a broadly used epithet in our culture. It's really meant to be an insulting sort of thing. And so I wouldn't call the U.S. Army and the Catholic Church and things like that cults. But when they're particularly centered on a single individual in which people are detached from their family members and reference groups, things like that, then it becomes cult-like, that sort of thing. And do I think this is actually somehow getting worse than it used to be? It's hard to say. From a social scientist, to answer the question properly, would need to operationally define what you mean by pseudoscience or superstitions or cults. Or you'd have to pick a particular subject, and then you need to define how you're going to measure the change. I mean, is it number of movies about cult-like or psychic phenomena like The Sixth Sense? Is it number of films, is it number of books, number of magazine articles, column inches in newspapers? And what's your time frame? 90s compared to the 80s, compared to the 60s, compared to 1900, compared to 1500. I suspect it's not as bad as it was, say, in 1500 if you were just talking about how superstitious the average guy in the street is. Hopefully, since we live in the age of science, we've made some progress. But it is surprising, since we live in the age of science, that 2/3 of Americans believe in psychic power, half believe in UFOs, the aliens are here, and that sort of thing. It is surprising, considering that we do live in such an advanced age.
And what's your take, Jodi?
I think the biggest change since the 60s is media and technology. And that one of the things that has happened to us is that a lot of stories that might have been known only to small subgroups are now known to everybody. So what's interesting is not that Americans believe weird stuff. I mean, folks have always believed weird stuff. What's really interesting is why everybody else cares, right? Why does the Washington Post care about bizarre belief systems, right? And I think that the reason people care is that we're fascinated with those folks who are willing to doubt mainstream reality. And the reason we're fascinated by those folks willing to doubt mainstream reality is that most of us do. And the reason most of us do is it's so complicated now. Right? All of the technology makes it so complicated, and the stakes are very high. Right? One thing goes wrong with genetic engineering, and we're history. Right? One thing goes wrong with nuclear power, we're gone. So the stakes are very, very high, and to say that now science can save us, that strikes me as nuts, right? Science can go just as far the other way. So when we think about folks who believe in weird stuff, I think we're attracted to them because they're willing to take that step that most of us take in tiny little ways.
Alex, do you think that the people you met and interviewed were taking a step away from the technological drive of society?
Yeah, definitely. It's not just science. I talked about it. Most of these people are reacting against the way the world is right now. So it's a science, you know, big government, fairly liberal democracy, various aspects of the way current reality is, they just don't want any part of it. Either the world's too sinful, or sometimes it's people who are left out, too. A lot of the people, I have a lot of pseudoscientists in the book, and they think they are scientists, and they're not. They're crackpots. You know, they're people who are trying to invent perpetual motion machines, or think that Space Brothers are landing next year at a precise day. It's because, you know, they're usually not people who had a chance to get a PhD. They either didn't have the money or they didn't have the intellect. But they still have these urges to do these things, and this is sort of their way of saying, I don't accept that science has all the answers and I can only consume it. I want to produce something. And so it's an active thing in that way.
Yeah, and it raises a question, too, of whether or not we can all agree that some things are real and some things are imaginary. I mean, do we get to the position where science is simply somebody's opinion, where facts are simply a prejudice? Joel, what's your take on that?
I think science is one of the great heroic feats of the human species, and that, you know, I'm not a scientist, I'm a newspaper reporter, but, you know, people gave their lives to find out the truth about the world we live in. You know, the fact to be able to say that the Earth goes around the sun and not vice versa, you know, got Galileo and Giordano Bruno in a lot of trouble. You know, this is something that, it kind of amazes me, actually, that so many people just sort of, I don't want to say seem unappreciative, but just sort of absorb all the technology and science that that enters our daily lives, takes it for granted, and then goes off and says, well, science is narrow-minded. I don't actually think science is narrow-minded. I think science has repeatedly given us some mind-boggling models of reality, ranging from, you know, the expanding universe. I mean, the whole universe is expanding. I mean, that's not something that necessarily is commonsensical. To, you know, the existence of dinosaurs, you know, that millions of years ago these giant reptiles were pounding around the planet. I mean, that is an amazing idea. You know, tectonic drift. I mean, the fact that entire continents can float on the surface of the planet and move around is, again, it's a very challenging idea that has been borne out over time. And so it kind of bums me out that people think science is this sort of narrow view of reality, when I look at science as being the kind of combined effort of thousands and thousands of men and women over a very long period of time trying to find out, well, what is the sort of reality behind the world as we perceive it?
Michael, is it becoming simply a matter of faith over proof?
Well, I'm a pretty pro-science guy, so I concur with Joel on a lot of that. On the other hand, the examples that you gave were where the demarcations are pretty clear between what's sense and nonsense, and we've got confirmation and almost total agreement amongst most scientists on a lot of these things. When you get into the social sciences, it's a lot fuzzier, and those fuzzy sets have big fuzzy boundaries between the sense and the nonsense, and it's harder to say, you know. So a lot of issues of Skeptic magazine we devote to these social issues because that's where the action is for me. It's not clear. We did a whole issue on race and IQ when the bell curve came out. Boy, you talk about lack of agreement and egos and people getting upset. The data do not just speak for themselves. They are definitely filtered through theories, and particularly in the social sciences, science is very much theory-driven. And so we have to be cautious about some of those social claims. And of course, even in biology, where we know evolution's a fact, it's not in Kansas and some other places in America. And it's really definitely an American phenomenon that evolution is even challenged. Nowhere else in the world, except a little pocket in Australia, do people even doubt that evolution happened. They may argue about how it happened, and punctuated equilibrium and gradualism, these sorts of things. But that tells us that there's a cultural element there involved in science. And as for faith, in how we believe, I really make the argument that these are two separate things, reason and faith, or science and religion. Mainly because the problem, if you're religious, with trying to prove your tenets of faith is that you're always chasing science. You're always one step behind, wondering where it's going. And what did they discover today? Oh, no, they found another black hole. Oh, dear. Now, let's see. This is not in Genesis. Now, how am I going to reconcile this with my religious? You know, if you're constantly thinking, I got to somehow prove that my religion is true, then you're going to be stuck with the ever-changing nature of science and having to change your religious tenets to go along with that. And I think that's the biggest argument from the religious side for why you shouldn't be trying to do science when it's really just religion.
Jodi, do you think that some of the scientific certainties that we hold very closely now, in 100, 200 years, might look like bloodletting to people of the future?
I actually think that they're scientific things that we think we're certain about that we're actually not. For example, salt. I don't know if anybody remembers, but about 2 years ago, I think it was Scientific American came out with all the debate about salt. Health people and medical scientists disagree about whether salt is bad for us or not. If people follow diets as they're given to the American public, there's a big debate about whether or not you should eat a lot of protein or eat a lot of carbohydrates. I mean, these are things that we're taught are basic science that the scientists seem to know. But then once you start digging a little bit, we realize that there's major disagreement. So how mad cow disease is transmitted, that's not clear. There's a huge debate about that. So I actually think that it's important to remember that what seems to be a clear-cut set of facts is not clear-cut at all. The other thing I want to add is that it's weird how people who want to give a strong defense of science against pseudoscience want to say, oh, science has amazing ideas and is not just common sense. But then they turn around and say, oh, those UFO people, they don't have common sense and they've got American ideas. I mean, not American, I'm sorry, they've got amazing, wild ideas. So I start to worry that no matter how it's sliced, the people who are doing wild stuff always end up getting trashed, right? Either they've got too much common sense because science has amazing ideas, or they've got too amazing ideas because science has the monopoly on common sense. Finally, on whether or not people who do UFO stuff or so-called fringe stuff are really on the fringes, or whether or not they're really people who are left out. I got into this field because of Harvard professor John Mack's work, because he believes that the abductees are telling the truth. I was shocked that someone in the university of the country would go that far. So I'm not even sure enough to say that people with wild, so-called fringe ideas are really on the fringe at all.
Well, John Mack is certainly the unnamed elephant in the room in a lot of respects. Alex, let me ask you, you touched upon something earlier. How many of the millennial events do you think are a direct result of the assignment desk's obsession with them? Would people really care? Would it be the tree falling in the forest and nobody would really bother?
No, I think there's steady interest, but they didn't care. I used to write about this stuff in the late 80s, and I had trouble selling these story ideas because people would say, that's fascinating, but what's the hook? And there isn't a hook. The fact that there are people, Christians who believe the world will end as described in Revelation, there's not always a clear reason to get into it. So, but I do think, we definitely had a surge of interest. The other thing I noticed, I got a lot of calls from TV reporters who are the laziest people in the world. And they're like, we got to do a piece on millennial groups. Can you give me 5 names? And I want people who are like bunkering down. They're probably going to kill themselves. And so there's always this assumption that it's dangerous, negative, that the year 2000 and the midnight on January 1st was a major flashpoint. All that can be true, but it's usually not true. And I kept saying, most of these people, when their thing doesn't happen, they've already built in a clause to their beliefs that will allow them to go on. Now with Y2K, that was impossible. It's one of the few times. But with Earth changes, which is a very widespread belief that the planet is trying to kill us by producing more natural disasters, they used to talk about 98 as being the trigger year when you could not mistake that this was happening. And then it was a bad weather year, but it wasn't like they thought. So they switched and said, the spirits say that 2012, we've been given an extension.
Kind of like a great student loan program.
Yeah.
Joel, speaking of escape clauses, you mentioned Carl Sagan shifting his frontier further and further away. For example, the moon around Mars being possibly a man-made construct. What was your experience with the escape clause phenomenon?
Well, Sagan said at one point in the 60s, and for many years, he entertained the idea that Phobos, one of the moons of Mars, might be a hollow object. That is a construction of some intelligent civilization. And Sagan is sort of the hero of my book because he entertains these wild ideas, but he has the ability at the last minute to sort of pull back and say, but what do we really know? And he was willing, up until really his deathbed, to say that even though he had spent his whole life trying to find extraterrestrial life, even though he wanted to know the truth about life beyond Earth, he knew that he had not found it. And it takes a lot of courage to say, I don't know, in a situation like this, because typically in this topic, the alien topic, people say, oh, I know exactly what the reality is. And they try to prove it to you. What Jodi said before, I want to address that about, are scientists good and UFO true believers bad? I mean, you weren't making it that simple, but I try to show in my book that scientists are just, in many ways, very much like everyone else in that they have belief systems that they pursue, and sometimes it colors the way they view the world. I mean, Sagan thought there were 1 million civilizations in this galaxy at this moment, 1 million other intelligent civilizations. And that, he had no data to support that. I mean, he had an estimate that he made based on this thing called the Drake equation. But you find, in fact, throughout the scientific world, a lot of very wild ideas that are not necessarily true. In fact, in my book, there's a chapter on Charlottesville, because I came here for a meeting of the Society for Scientific Exploration, where all kinds of, unusual ideas about, past life recall and near-death experiences are entertained. And so I try to show that it's not like, there's a divide between, the hard scientists and then the soft-minded cultural believers.
Excuse me, Michael. One thing I'm curious about is this whole fuzzy zone, the shift between knowing something and being skeptical. And in the past, we might be skeptical in order to drive ourselves toward knowing something really, really well. Do you find that there's no room for skepticism among certain believers? And do you find yourself a very unwelcome guest in a lot of venues?
Yes.
Moving on.
Let me just tell you a little story, actually, that I recount in Why People Believe Weird Things, and that is in August of 1983, I was abducted by aliens. It's true. It actually happened, or something happened. And so the story goes like this, and this, I'm not making this up either. I was traveling down a lonely rural highway in Nebraska, and isn't that always where these things happen, lonely rural highways? But I was, and it was about 3 a.m., and a large craft with bright lights came up over my left shoulder and stopped me, and they took me into the craft where I lost 90 minutes of time. Abductees call this missing time. They write books about missing time. And the next thing I knew, I was like out of the craft and traveling back down the road. And I distinctly remember the aliens, what they looked like. They looked just like people. In fact, they looked just like people that I knew. But I knew that they were aliens because they had stiff little fingers. And I could see that, and that was my clue that I knew that they knew, but they didn't know that I knew that they were aliens. So I was going along with this whole thing, knowing that I knew, but that they didn't know, and this went on and on. Anyway, and I used to tell this story when I was teaching a psych course on, when I get to the part on schizophrenia, where schizophrenics hear voices. They really hear the voices. The experiences are very real for them, and so I would tell that story because it's a very real experience for me. Now I tell the story in the context of aliens, because when I was telling the story back in the early 80s, the stuff wasn't big. Now it's huge, and everybody's being abducted by aliens. In my case, the explanation is that traveling down the lonely rural highway, I was actually on a bicycle, in the middle of a transcontinental bike race called Race Across America that I founded and raced in a number of times. And the race has rules in which you don't stop. It's from west coast to east coast. First one there wins. Everybody takes the same route. And so there's no sleep. Or you can sleep if you want, but then you fall behind. So I'd gone 83 hours without sleep and ridden 1,250 miles without stopping, except for a few potty breaks in the motorhome that always follows behind you at night with bright white lights, with a support crew that looks just like people you know. And so, and over the years, I've done informal studies with the various riders, and when I quit racing the race, and I'd still go along and study the sleep patterns of the riders, and everybody was hallucinating like crazy in the early years because they didn't figure out the sleep pattern stuff. So the 90 minutes of missing time, by the way, I was weaving down the road at about 5 miles an hour, hallucinating away, and my crew stopped me and put me in for a 90-minute sleep break, which is a nice cycle because you can get down to the deep and back up to the light, sleep, and then back going again, and you'd be amazed what you can do in 90 minutes of sleep. But that's the missing time. And the stiff little finger is where is really the crux of the story is that when I was a kid, there was a story, a TV show on CBS starring Roy Thinnis. I just saw him on X-Files a few months ago, in fact. Yeah. Anyway, and the aliens were taking over the planet, and they looked just like humans. And again, one of these stories, somehow they've mastered interstellar space travel, and they could take over DNA and replicate somebody's body, but they couldn't bend their fingers. Anyway, so they had to wear gloves and go through all these contrivances so that people wouldn't notice the stiff little fingers, but I noticed. So there, how odd that 20 years after the fact, deep in the recesses of my memory, comes this television theme story, this sci-fi story that gets inculcated into a dream state, a hallucination, triggered by the stress of physical exhaustion and mental exhaustion from sleep deprivation. Now, I don't claim abductees have been sleep deprived. I don't know what's going on with them. They had a bad pork chop the night before, or they're just fantasy prone. But when they tell you over and over and over that the abduction happened late at night at 3 in the morning when I was in my bed asleep, it seems like a more obvious hypothesis than abduction is sleep deprivation or a sleep hallucination or a lucid dream or something like that. And so, and in that case, I think, back to the what is science discussion, I think we can actually say in some instances whether things are true or not. And in any case, you certainly behaviorally act as if they're true or not. We make those decisions, even if intellectually we say, we qualify and say, well, maybe, perhaps, this kind of thing. Behaviorally, no one's an agnostic. And Sunday morning, you get up, tomorrow morning, you're either going to church or you're staying home to watch football or whatever's on. And so you make that decision. And for me, the decision is made that aliens are not coming here. They are not here. And I conceivably changed my mind, but I really need to see one of those, probe instruments that they, I just asked these guys, bring home an ashtray, something from the spacecraft, and they never do.
We have a few of those in the lobby afterwards.
The ashtrays or the probes?
Well, it depends on how you want to use an ashtray, I guess. Jodi, Michael just mentioned the TV show The Invaders, and does anybody in here remember the TV show The Invaders? It's a great show, and one of the things it did was make you very, very paranoid that everybody around you was somehow, an alien. To what extent does the alien phenomenon, do you think, intersect with our natural homegrown paranoia growing up out of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy and all the other conspiracies we've dealt with in the culture?
I think paranoia is part of being an American. The Declaration of Independence is a paranoid document, right? It has not, in addition to the wonderful preamble, right, the rest of it's a list of grievances that are designed to show that the king was involved in a conspiracy against the colonists. So since then, it's part of being an American, is to be paranoid. And now with cameras everywhere, I mean, even in this room, how are we not to be a little bit paranoid? I actually wanted to address Michael and Joel's point. I think a lot of abductees would like the kind of certainty of reality that Michael describes. And in fact, I think that abductees are a lot more skeptical than either of them think that they are, and I probably think that they're more skeptical than they are. If Carl Sagan is the hero of Joel's book, I guess Bud Hopkins is probably the hero of mine. He's an abduction researcher and an artist in New York. And he has a wonderful little saying that he's more skeptical than Carl Sagan because he's willing to question everyday reality. And that's one of the things that I found in my research with abductees, is that they don't believe anything for sure. They're not 100% convinced about UFOs or aliens or what they've been through. All they know is that they've experienced something that they absolutely can't explain and that they can't understand and that they're not getting very much support for. So I think it's important to think about, what does it actually mean to be skeptical and how far can one go? Because I think that most abductees go really, really far, and because they're in their willingness to question everyday reality, they go a lot further than some so-called skeptics.
And Alex, just to pick up on this note of skepticism and believing, to what extent do you think the people really are skeptical, and to what extent do you think they're enabled by great scientists, perhaps someone like John Mack?
Wait, which people?
People who've been abducted by aliens. I mean, do they really examine this, or are some of these events repressed memories or planted
I don't know much
memories?
about abductees nearly as much as these guys, so I shouldn't wander down that path. But I do think, just talking about skepticism, one of the things about these beliefs is it's not a choice with most people. It's just there. And I often come to a point where I try to explain why somebody believes something. And you can't ultimately explain it, and they can't either, because if you ask them, why do you believe this? And you're asking them to step aside and look at themselves as a specimen, well, it's not a belief, it's the truth. And so it's not something they can do anything about, and most of them pursue these beliefs without hurting anyone. There are major exceptions to that. And what I like in a skeptic, Shermer here, operates the way I think they should. He reads their material. He says, I disagree with all of this, and here are my counter-arguments. There's a strain of skepticism, though, that goes farther than that, almost puritanically saying it is it is bad by definition that anybody believes these things, and we have to figure out something to do about it beyond providing counter arguments. And you know, we don't do that in this country. We don't have a police state saying you can't believe these things. But there are places where it is like that. And I defend people's right to have goofball ideas, you know.
Speaking of condemning people's ideas and all the rest, which sounds like almost a reactionary Christian sort of thing, perhaps not to diss the Christians too much, because they were once there themselves. But how much of this is an interface between superstition and religion?
Well, I'm not sure I can address that in great depth. I mean, in fact, in reporting this book, felt kind of challenged in my inability to really appreciate the origins of religion, the origins of belief. I realized when I went into this book, I wanted to find out, well, what is the truth about life beyond Earth? I mean, my book is actually, I mean, 2/3 of it is about what you'd say is science. It's about the space program. It's about the SETI search for radio signals. Only the middle part is the UFO stuff. And I, in fact, kind of, you know, go down that road and then throw up my hands and say, there's no information here. I mean, the bad thing about the aliens that come and abduct people is they don't actually tell you anything about themselves. Aliens have no information, they have no history. I mean, it'd be so great if they would say, well, here's the, you know, the last 1,000 years of history of our civilization in the Pleiades, but they don't give that. I mean, they're very mysterious, slippery creatures who just take little, you know, segments of your DNA and then run away, you know, and it's, so as far as trying to find the truth about life beyond Earth, I find that the UFO hypothesis has a deficit of information and is fundamentally not that interesting. I mean, you know, the problem with that whole scenario, in my opinion, is that it's not true. I mean, the aliens are not here. That is my take on it. Now, I'm just a newspaper reporter, so no one should believe what I say about that. But for me, trying to find out, you know, what is the biology of the universe? I mean, we're in this amazing moment right now in which, thanks to these incredible telescopes we have, we know, or we have the information to believe that we live in this unbelievably huge universe in which the Earth is a tiny little world. I mean, just one little planet around one star that's maybe among 100 billion stars in one galaxy among 50 billion galaxies. So this sort of challenges us to figure out, you know, what's going on here? What does that mean? And we know the structure of that universe fairly well. I mean, we have all this data coming in about what's out there structurally, the physics of the universe. What do we know about the biology of the universe? What do we know about life beyond Earth? And the truth is, we don't really know anything at all. Right now, we don't have any information about a single microbe from beyond this planet, except for the assertion by this one team of NASA scientists that they found some microbes in that meteorite from Mars. That claim, as I show in the book, is very questionable. Most people in that field, you know, who are fellow meteoriticists, people who study this stuff, say they don't got the goods on that claim. We don't, at the moment, know of any liquid water beyond this planet. So before we find, you know, intelligent aliens, and before we find even a microbe of life out there, it'd be nice to find some, just, you know, some liquid water. So that's where we're at right now. And to me, it's sort of an amazing puzzle, because we may be in this sort of special moment in human history before the discovery of the truth about the biology of the universe. Unfortunately, you know, you can go to scientists and try to get information, and it's like, you know, it can be really difficult to get any real facts out of them. But definitely in the UFO world, you find it even harder to find anything that you could really say, this feels like the truth.
Michael,
48 hours of nonfiction books on TV. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Next, from the Virginia Festival of the Book, a panel discussion with 5 authors who've written about unexplained phenomena, conspiracy theories, and supernatural experiences. After that, a conversation with Christopher Andrew, who wrote The Sword and the Shield, about the history of the KGB. On Book TV tomorrow night, Lucas Poe discusses the politics of the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren. Also, Malcolm Gladwell talks about The Tipping Point, his new book, exploring why certain ideas take hold in society and others do not. And Biography on Book TV looks at the generalship of Robert E. Lee with a panel of Lee biographers.
Can you tell us about a book that you've been reading?
Actually, we've all been reading Anne Frank.
The diary.
The Diary of Anne Frank. The Diary of a Young Girl.
And why are you reading it?
Well, it's for a class project, and it's like about her life in the Holocaust, and like,
Every weekend here on C-SPAN 2. From the Virginia Festival of the Book in Charlottesville, Virginia, a discussion with several authors who have written about unexplained phenomena, including conspiracy theories and supernatural experiences. The conversation lasts about an hour and a half.
Well, looks like this is it. Can you all hear me? Everybody hear me? Let me just begin by getting a feel for where everyone is in the audience. Is there anybody here who can claim to have seen a UFO? Hands? A couple? Is there anyone here who can claim to have seen ghosts or anything like that? Out-of-body experiences? A couple? Is there anybody here who belongs to a cult? Yeah, Episcopal Church counts, actually. Is there anybody here who is packing right now? Well, I guess we can proceed then. Yeah. Today's subject is
college where they read all the great books, and I was a terrible student in college. I didn't read anything I was supposed to read, so I'm trying to make up for lost time, and I got stuck with this book. This book is very dry.
Can you tell us about a book that you've read recently?
Yes, I had the good fortune of reading Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, a British author. It's published by Random House. Came out, I believe, in 1995, thereabouts. It's a fascinating story. It's about World War I and the incredible human sacrifice involved. The hero is a Britisher, and he has a love affair around 1910, before the war, with a French lady. But it's a little bit on the lurid side with regard to that affair. Overdo it, really. But aside from that, I thought it was a marvelous depiction of the horrors of trench warfare.
Our website, booktv.org, brings you a look at some of this week's best-selling books. Click on bestseller lists, and you'll find a sampling of nonfiction bestsellers from across the country. Here's a look at one of this week's featured lists. The top 10 best-selling nonfiction books according to the New York Times. Number 1 this week, Mitch Albom's Tuesdays with Morrie. It's followed by The Rock Says, an autobiography by the professional wrestler known as The Rock. In The Millionaire Mind, at number 3, Thomas Stanley poses questions designed to assess the reader's money-making potential. Then, former Reagan speechwriter Peggy Noonan's new book, The Case Against Hillary Clinton, comes in at number 4. Detective Steve Thomas discusses his involvement with the investigation into the murder of 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey in JonBenet, written with Don Davis. Sidney Poitier writes about his life and career in The Measure of a Man, at number 6 this week. That's followed by Fair Ball, a fan's case for baseball by sportscaster Bob Costas. Tis, the follow-up memoir by Angela's Ashes author Frank McCourt, comes in at number 8 this week. Sybil Shepherd's new autobiography, Civil Disobedience, is 9th. And Dave Eggers' memoir, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, rounds out the list at number 10. For book reviews and more bestseller lists, visit the New York Times website and click on Books. You're watching Book TV. 48 hours of programs about nonfiction books, authors, and the publishing industry.
We've all been finding it really interesting just how to see her in her isolation and how they all survived, like being together with 8 people in one secret attic.
Do you think that her story has anything to say to you guys about the way you live now?
Oh yeah, of course, because it shows people and it kind of teaches people that, like she said in the very ending of the diary actually, that everyone has a good side, and that she even respected everyone, and she respected everyone that even brought her like a little harshness because she learned in that time that she was reading her diary and everything.
Yeah, and she has like a lot of she has faith that like she can get out and just keep going to school like she was, and I don't know.
And at the end, are you all going to get together with all of your class and talk about it as a whole group?
Yeah, we've already started doing that, but we had a project to isolate ourselves for an hour each day for 7 days, and we couldn't listen to the radio.
We couldn't do anything with technology or radio, or we had to write.
Yeah, I think that really helped me understand what she was going through, and it really brought out what she went through.
Yes, for the last 6 months I've been trying to read this book, The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. I picked up one of those syllabuses from St. John's